Ṣẹ̀kẹ̀rẹ̀ lọ bá jó, ṣẹ̀kẹ̀rẹ̀ lọ bá jó, olúwa mi ò dìde ojó ṣẹ̀kẹ̀rẹ̀.
Hello and welcome to the Ashen Forge. I am Phantom X, joined as always by Diggs and the legendary Neurotoxin. And we have a very special guest, Steven Sharif from Ashes of Creation, creative director. Thank you, Steven, for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm very excited. It's been a while since I've been on the show. I don't even know. When was the last time?
Almost 3 years. Actually, I checked just before we went on. It was May of 2018. That you were with
crazy.
us. I know, that's a long time ago.
Where does the time go?
I know. I keep thinking that. Yep.
The world has completely changed since the last time we spoke.
So much so. And I think that's one of the things because, I would have hoped that we'd have seen each other at PAX in the last 2 years or something.
I know.
And,
Those were always such fun times. You just reminded me how sad it is that we didn't do that.
Yeah.
So before we get going, we're going to have obviously a lot of people who don't know us or haven't watched us before. We've been doing this, actually 7 years this year. And with Ashes of Creation really since Kickstarter. So we're happy you are here to join us. And we're kind of different. We take more of a conversational perspective. So don't expect sort of a, list of questions that we're going to pepper Steven with. So certainly we have questions, but I always preface that because people often are like, what is going on here? You're just kind of rambling on. Well, sorry, that's kind of how we do things. So that being said, we only have an hour, so let's jump right in.
Yeah.
Actually, I have my first question is, Steven, we've got about 2 weeks before the next alpha preview.
Yep.
What are you excited about? What do you want to talk about? That's my first question is what would you like to talk about?
About the preview coming up in 2 weeks?
Just in general. That's one thing.
Oh, just in general?
Yeah. In terms of Ashes of Creation, what's on your mind?
Well, we are very excited about the test coming up, so that's definitely at the forefront of my mind. But no, I'm really excited to kind of, see the changes that we've implemented on the technical side of things to kind of accommodate a more optimized, server performance. Seeing those in action, it's one thing to see them with bots; it's another thing to see them with live players. And also, from like a metrics and dashboard perspective, able to see that stuff in real time and get those metrics. That's always a fun, aspect of it. I think we've dedicated, the past few weeks towards beefing those up from a real time, like information gathering, and also the ability to deploy hot fixes. Typically our build times, can be rather lengthy. So when we do notice a problem, especially if it's content related problem and we have to repackage, a new client, that can always be a scary thought because, how destabilizing is the problem? Can we maintain the servers while we're trying to deploy this fix? How fast is that going to be? It's an hour and a half because it's content related. And, that can always be kind of scary. But I think we've rejiggered kind of our build process, especially for a hotfix scenario. And I'm going to be excited to kind of see that in the works during this next playtest.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really liked about how you dealt with the BR is that you chose not to keep it up 24/7, because that's kind of what I think was the problem with Landmark back in the day. They kind of did the same thing where they want to put this quick thing up with just starting with just players. So you wouldn't have to worry about creatures and all the AI and all that stuff. But leaving it up the whole time just causes people to focus on that, make sure that people are able to play the whole time. Mm-hmm. And so deciding to take it offline eventually, so you don't have that distraction at all. Well, even if it's just a little bit, it's nice to not have the distraction at all.
Well, typically, in game in the games industry, when you have a live product, you also have a live ops team, right? And they're typically, segregated away from the live development team. Whereas, we're a live project in development, so we don't really have a dedicated live ops team. So we kind of have to cannibalize the development team during these testing periods to kind of watch the performance of the game and actively react to when things aren't going right. And that can be super stressful for developers because now they're having to transition from this, active development and testing things in the development branch, and then now we're moving to a live production branch, and there are players here, and we have to be conscientious of that. And our pager duty is active, and things can go wrong in the middle of the night, and all of these things can be a little bit scary during development. But that's why we kind of try to segment these sections into small testable periods, so we don't burn out our engineers on kind of watching these things, at least until we get to a phase where it can be more persistent, where we're more confident in the stability of the product and its core gameplay loop, and we want to have that kind of persistent alpha phase. Then we actually bring on board a live ops team, and they get to service the live product to the players.
Gotcha. So here's, I guess, a little question on that. A lot of times it's a problem that a lot of developers in open development run into, where they're building or they're working, and then they see they've got a convention coming up and they've got to stop everything they're doing and make something that's playable. And then once they've done that, they have to go back through and break out and revert all the things that they had to hack in just to make it playable.
For sure.
So in terms of what's going on here, is there still a lot of that going on, or is everything streamlined so it's pretty close to what you'd be seeing on the test servers and the internal servers, and there isn't much like breaking and unbreaking to do the live tests?
Yeah, there's not too much breaking and unbreaking during these tests. Definitely, like a year or 2 years ago when we would kind of show up at PAX with a playable demo, there were opportunities there where you kind of cut corners from a code perspective to kind of, get things in an operational sense. They may not be foundationally good for how you want to, build the game moving forward, but you take those hacks and cuts to kind of get something out into the player's hands. We did a lot of that very early on, but everything was done in a sense to kind of progress forward regardless of that. Like, we always knew where those incisions were made and how we needed to go back and fix them, and we would partition, our development branch from our kind of production branch. Now we really aren't doing that too much. We definitely do take some things into consideration because we're open development, we're transparent development. And so with that regard, you kind of have to make sure things are presentable, right? Like, you get some leeway because we're really open with the community and you guys understand that, this is an active development, but you oftentimes will get a viewer who doesn't know that, right? More often than not, especially when you get some traction among, certain streamers with what you're showing. That can always be scary because you're excited, hey, people are, hearing about the product, but oh no, people are hearing about the product. It's we're not ready for that yet. So we do take that into consideration. Sometimes there are hacks essentially that are implemented in order to make sure that things are kind of working well. Like for example, I'll just use it as one example. The caravan, we want it to be physics based in how its movement works, right? And that can get a little janky when you're talking about uneven terrain and obstacles and foliage and whatnot. So there were some hackiness that we had to put in there to make sure that it was running smoothly and didn't look super like the wheels half under the ground and it was getting stuck on stuff. So it was there were some hacks put in to make sure that would function well with live audience and during some streaming, but needs to get rejiggered after that testing event. But as long as we make notations of what that is and where it needs to get fixed, and we understand its first phase, that's okay with me. But yeah, that happens sometimes for sure.
I was actually, one of the things I was curious about, what you had just mentioned with the streamers getting attention. We've obviously been following you for, 4 years, 5 years, I don't know how long now. And to see, one, it was awesome to see so much attention this past, 2020 with YouTube streamers. But I was curious, if that does sort of change your approach or your schedule, I guess, of how you are looking at things when all of a sudden you have so many people paying attention where you didn't before.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it changes necessarily the schedule. I'm not sure, how much per se it would change. It definitely can be a fun and exhilarating ride to get exposure, especially at a stage when games don't typically get exposure like that. But I think really the effort is effective communication to those people who are watching, and sometimes that can fall on the responsibility of the content, provided the content creator themselves, to kind of make sure they preface and frame the discussion and or exposure. And you can't always control content creators, right? Like they do their own thing, they have their own audience, they're kind of they're servicing that end of it. But one thing I do try to do is be as outgoing as possible and connecting with those content creators. So like, I think this last summer, many people saw, like, I did interviews and whatnot. Well, that was because like I'm literally getting tagged in Discord. Hey, somebody's watching this review from Lazy Peon or whatever. And I'm like, oh no, I need to get in there. I need to make sure that everybody understands these viewers have no idea about the game. We need to talk about this. And so I'll text them on like Twitter while it's happening, or I'll text them on Discord. And I'll be like, hey, I'm happy to come chat about this if you want to have me. And luckily, most of those big guys, they responded and are like, yeah, we'd love to chat with you. So at least then I get to provide their audiences with context on what they're seeing, right? Like, this is an active development. We are a Western publisher and developer. And, you got to take that into consideration when you're watching this stuff. It's not an end product. It still has a lot of work to go. But here we're open, transparent. Come join the community. You can follow along.
Cool. I have a question from the Golden Feather that's a little bit related.
Sure.
Asking about the short time span between the March and April testing timeframes. They say one would think the team would need more time to address issues before expanding the tester count so greatly.
Sure. No, that's a great question. So I guess that really kind of falls into the category of how scheduling occurs, like from a production standpoint. Like when we aim from a feature set to a QA period, we're aiming for March. The April date really doesn't come into our minds at all. Like March is our end date, right? And a few weeks before that is our feature complete date. And that's where we then provide time for like bug fixes and a little bit of polish that we can include. We're really aiming for March. So the time between March and April isn't a matter of like implementing new things, isn't a matter of, considering additional features for that April date. It's more along the lines of like, okay, this is a beta test for March. If I'm thinking of alpha as a full game launch, I would say March is like the beta test date. And are there any emergencies? Are there any critical errors that surface during that March test? And if so, that's our, do or die phase between then and April. We determine whether or not we would have to postpone or push out the April date further because of what we saw in March, or we can say, hey, we have the time to bug fix this, and we'll still be good for April. So, traditionally, that's kind of how you would form a schedule. Is you have a list of feature sets, you have a number of resources, and you have a timeline that you are acceptable with. If you want to change anything, one of those three categories kind of has to move, right? So either you up your resources, you reduce your feature set, or you push out your timeline. And that's kind of how we go about that.
Yep. Cool.
So y'all had a lot of questions. I could take up the whole hour with crafting. So I'm trying to stay quiet, and I'm going to wait my turn.
I don't know that we have turns, so y'all.
Yeah, no, there aren't turns. You should fire away. I actually did have one sort of thing that I've been wondering about for a little bit. It's kind of this interesting sort of like detail to reconcile that. When somebody normally dies, or potentially when their place gets attacked in, some sort of major battle at a location, they won't necessarily lose items unless they're actually corrupted, but they'll be able to lose raw and processed resources. So I'm trying to figure out, because that's a little bit of an odd sort of thing, because it means people who have predominantly completed items, they might suffer a bit of durability loss on things that they're carrying, but they certainly won't lose their entire inventory if they get taken out in the field. So is part of the reason why people can lose the resources about being able to attack the enemy supply line, and the completed items are kind of protected in a special way because nobody wants to lose the thing they worked so hard to build up?
Sure, that's a great question. So it's important to think about the concept behind material loss. So when players die and they take durability loss, our durability loss isn't like other games where it's a gold sink, so to speak. It's a combination of both a gold sink and a material sink. So in a sense, even if you only have completed items, when you're taking that durability loss, you are losing out on materials. It's just a debt to the material that you're losing instead of the active loss of that material in your inventory. So now you're accruing a material debt if you want to actually repair and increase again the performance of those particular items that take that durability loss. So in a sense, it's the same between players who lose out on a portion of those materials, but it's actually exacerbated to a degree because now they're not only taking that durability loss, but they're also losing a portion of the materials that are in their inventory. So the concept there is that this is a part of the engine that is supply and demand. So the server is constantly generating these materials on tick, right? As they kind of propagate throughout the world and get repopulated, players are going out there and they're collecting these things. We want to make sure that there is a driving force and factor behind what crafters and gatherers are out there doing. There's constantly going to be a demand for them to supply these things, whether that death is from PvP or from PvE. These are going to be necessities for players to constantly, essentially provide.
Cool. And then I guess one other thing, this was a big question for me with the So Long Sancta stuff, which was revealed in the last one, that rogues can actually steal things out of people's inventories, it appears. So I guess the question is, do other archetypes or classes have the ability to affect people's inventory without killing them, or is that a rogue special?
Where does it say that rogues can steal things from people's inventories?
Okay, so that's exactly what I've been asking about. In the So Long Sanctus series, the jewel that they found in a bush was stolen during combat, and the fighter chased the rogue down and made them cough it up. So that implies that they're stealing in combat. Is that not actually a thing?
No, that's not a thing. So that might be some.
That had me super confused.
So there's two things going on there. One, there's going to be some story element to whatever was going on with that. With regards to like the rogues chasing them down and making them cough it up. That's like, hey, give me that back, and the player's like, oh, okay, here you go. That's the first thing. Second thing of like, is there a component to steal something from another player? There is quest-related actions that can be associated, where you're not necessarily stealing an actual item or material from a player, but rather we tag a player as a quest component. And when you interact or approach that player and you perform the steal action, you're acquiring a quest item that isn't coming from their inventory per se, but you're accomplishing an objective within the quest. So it kind of gives you the feeling of like, yes, this player has been identified as a quest target, and there might be a relationship there. Maybe they have a title that qualifies them as a target of that quest. So like if you're a citizen of a node A and there's an individual who is, the head of node B's scientific, community or scholars academy, boom, now they become a target for some of these quest lines. And some player, they're like, hey, walking around and some dude just walks over like, come on. I mean, how many times has this been stolen from you? No, just but
no, that makes
some
sense.
Component there.
Yeah, and I guess with that, the idea that it then puts forth, and this is kind of like gives me a little bit of a tingly feeling, that you could just be walking around and stumble upon a MacGuffin that not only pertains to a quest you aren't aware of, but that other people will be able to home in on you because you're carrying. Like that's definitely like the sort of emergent gameplay that I would expect from like a Meow. So that's really cool. You're muted.
Oops, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
There you go.
I don't know what happened. What was I saying? Yeah, no, that type of emergent gameplay is obviously the objective behind, like, how can we accommodate, a non-static quest line? And that's and the way you do that is like you can apply a flag to a title, and whoever holds that title now becomes a target of that quest segment, right? And this can change too, because that title might change. Different people might rise up in the ranks of different societies and organizations, and like that creates something that, like, Diggs, you might have experienced 2 months ago, and then when I come along and take this quest, now I'm experiencing a different target and a different different, something that's just new and non-static and part of the living world. Like that's a cool component, I think. And it's easy to do. It's not like it's some crazy technological, game design that requires some special engine for, this is something that you can create and give the players something that feels living,
I think that's one of the neatest things behind Ashes of Creation, the node system, and the fact that Diggs and I could be on different servers and have two completely different experiences. Is
For
just,
sure.
Just the neatest thing about this. Actually, this is like thinking way down the line. We even last week started kind of musing on what is even an expansion as it relates to Ashes of Creation, right? Because it's not the sort of classic expansion that you
sure.
But anyways.
No, that's a good point. I mean, when you think about expansions, you try to think about the traditional games that exist. What is their game engine? What is their core gameplay loop? And then usually expansions relate to that in some degree. And most previous MMOs, their loop revolves around the adventuring class and the zones and the raids and stuff like that. And while we still have that component, and you will still see expansions relating to potentially, new zones that open up, new monsters, new bosses, gear progression, level progression, those types of things. You're going to also see expansions that are driven through the main engine of our gameplay loop, which is the node system and the quest lines that lie there and the types of buildings that can be constructed and the services that get offered to the players and the emergent gameplay that's, provided through these sieging systems, through the housing system. Like there's just so many MMOs are already ambitious projects, right? They're already the biggest projects you can do. Ours is particularly ambitious, and that's okay though, because we're constructing it in a way that one makes sense, two is driven through the node system, and three is utilizing current technology, right? So, all those things to a degree can make it manageable. But when you think about the content that's necessary, that's where the real uphill battle is present, right? We can construct these systems so that you can plug and play content into them, but it's going to take a large team. And that's why we're, back to hiring again, to really fill this world out in these systems that we're designing.
But are you thinking of expansions in terms of wait 2 or 3 years and drop a huge expansion? Or are you thinking of expansions in smaller subsets such that you can, I don't know, every 6 months or something like that?
Yeah, so we're thinking of expansions in two sense of the words, right? So we're thinking of expansions that come on a monthly and quarterly basis. Those are going to be more smaller, easily digestible. They progress the game world in something that is, maintainable for players to kind of follow along with, especially if you're playing the game. And then we're thinking of the large expansions that might happen once or twice, maybe a year, every 6 months, so to speak. Those larger expansions are where you're going to see, like level caps perhaps rise. You're going to see new sets of gears and stuff and zones that come online and new bosses that might get introduced. Really, there's the thing I would say about content expansions and where it kind of is driven home for the game is the popularity and the subscriber base of the game is going to determine how expansive those expansions are and how regular they can become. Because as everybody knows who plays games, content is king, right? The more stuff you have to provide the players to participate in, especially not just in the sense of like curated content, but the more tools you also use to react to that content in a way that is partially player driven can help to drive home what that experience is for players. And you always want to make sure that they have something to participate in that regard.
One of the things that, because Phantom had mentioned something that kind of ties into this a little bit, is Phantom was talking about different experiences on different servers. But the cool thing about the game design is that there should be different experiences on the same server. So coming in, quests are changing, or that city that I went to 2 months ago might not be there. It could be run by a completely different race. So even our own experience on the same server could be different. And I'm hoping that will drive what I consider to be role play, which is being in character and talking about the things that are happening in the world in character. And that's just naturally, when everybody's doing the exact same quest, you don't really have to have a conversation because you already know what that person did.
For sure.
But when cities are changing or disappearing or all kinds of stuff are happening, then you want to know, hey, what did you do last week? Or where did that city go? Or
For sure.
there's just stuff to talk about.
Yeah, and I think the example of the thief stealing something is a prime example of how a quest line can change given time, given history, right? And it can get much deeper than that as well. As you described, if a city no longer exists, where do those hooks on these quest lines, go to? And they go to different regions, they go to different targets, they go to different objectives, right? I think a linear history is something that's a very cool pillar of how Ashes intends to exist for players. And I think it has a lot of added benefit, not just from the diversity of an experience that you and I as a player can receive, but also MMOs tend to suffer two primary issues from a user acquisition standpoint and retention. One is these new areas, it's a static, empty new zones, and you can't really get new players because it's all social experience and there's nobody there to be social with. That's the first thing. Nodes can kind of address that a little bit because they bring end game level players back to those areas and they kind of let the areas evolve with the nodes as well. That's one thing that we accommodate. But the second thing is, as you described, if I join later, 4 months in, and you join, I'm going to experience something different. But the same thing is true for players who take a break. Let's say players take a break. They know when they come back that things can be wildly different. And that can be an appeal to kind of retain that player over time, reacquire them essentially, right? I think that's a cool aspect of what is to be a chronological history of each server being independent of one another and seeing things change in real time.
That does kind of
go ahead.
I was going to say that gets into a big question that I've had for a little while now, is the idea that from the sound of things, NPCs don't have like a true persistence. Like if there's a mastercraft, bow maker in Nakua Village, and that Nakua Village, or maybe not a village, it's a higher level settlement. Through warring, that settlement gets knocked way down, and then it gets built back up by, say, Renkai that took it over. Now that bowmaker, do they now no longer exist in the world, or can I find them as like a beach bum somewhere along the coastline trying to make it until they get a new opportunity?
No, so it depends, obviously, right? It depends on the NPC, but for the most part, if we're talking about specifically crafting, right, there are stations and NPCs that only come online when nodes in certain areas reach certain stages. So if nodes go away in those areas and they're no longer at that stage, then there may be a period of time, a window of time, where now items that had been previously made at that location are no longer capable of being made. And from an economic standpoint, this drives the price up, right? Because you're affecting the supply and not reducing the demand. So from an economic standpoint, this can provide a little bit of kind of trouble to a market, but those are troubles that should exist naturally because of how supply chains get interrupted. And this is something that players need to be conscientious of when a siege occurs. Who is this city serving? If I'm not a citizen at this node, right? Am I just going to walk away and say I don't care? No, because I might be benefiting from the armor from that node. I might be benefiting from the processing plants around that node. I might be benefiting from the recipes that come out of this node because of the reliquary. There are things that this node impacts on a world stage that players have to understand, and it's also a driving force for competing nodes, because if my particular recipes and craft stations and processing plants are not pulling in the same amount of economic yield as your node, that might drive me to destroy yours because I want to drive traffic to mine, right? This is that part of that dynamicism that you want to see in games, particularly as it relates to economies. And economies should have world events that impact what the status quo is. And that's, you think about real life economies, right? When you have market disruptions, when you have, certain things that occur, that's an opportunity. to a degree. It's an unfortunate happenstance for many people, but it's also an opportunity for those who can understand the trends and see where the direction of an economy is heading. Right, just to give you an idea of how this can be a impactful decision, the loss of a particular node, and as you were describing,
Gotcha.
that NPC.
So then that kind of
That
answers
should
the other
happen.
side of
But
the,
wait, but that
go
should let me ask this because I want to clarify. I think that can happen. It doesn't just have to happen because of the siege. I think that can happen if more Renkai contribute to the progression to the next stage, and it becomes a Renkai
Correct.
establishment instead
Right.
of just a.
So cultures also. So I was just using that as an example, the siege and destruction, but that's another component of world building and population differences on each server. So you may have a higher influx of Renkai oriented orcs on server A, and you may have Empyrean influence that's higher on server B. This is going to impact how these nodes develop from a cultural standpoint, and that's going to change these quest lines. It's going to change these loot tables potentially, and these spawners, all of these things are going to be impactful. The idea behind this is that these systems from a data perspective are constructed in a way to present flavor off of the players and community's decisions. Sometimes that flavor might not be understood or known, and I think that's a good thing. We don't want to let everyone power game the system and know how these things develop. Now, after time, if players are diligent enough to collect this information and provide it in some, surface it on some website or whatever, they may be able to ascertain what does what from an influence standpoint. But objectively speaking, we kind of want players to discover this for themselves, and that adds to it a sense of mysticism or mystery that really creates a compelling story.
Yeah, I think you pretty well answered it, but I guess the thing I was getting at is, let's say it was Jim, the master bowmaker in the Nakua village. That character isn't a citizen of the world so much as
of the node.
Kind of like an economic asset that exists at that time to exist a certain function. And once the conditions change, Jim, the bowmaker, no longer is needed and basically goes poof.
Right. It's that Jim, the bowmaker, existed as Jim, and his bows might be more, I don't want to give away specifically like these components, but Jim the bowmaker might be strength oriented, right? And his bow attributes, right? Now Ray the bowmaker, he came up a month later because Jim died in some siege, and Ray was a protege of Jim, and he popped up as an NPC in Node B, which is nearby. He's still working with bows, but his bows are more dex based because that's what he knows best, right? Like, I'm just trying to give you an idea, like how that changes. Jim won't come back. There's a storyline for Jim. If the node's rebuilt, then yes, Jim may come back with his bow and strength oriented because whatever. But you see how that can kind of change across the nodes.
Very cool. Thank you. That's been a huge question for me.
I feel bad for Jim now, actually.
We just have to get Jim back. So I have another related question to that, kind of related. So I'm wondering how impactful it is worldwide or server-wide to have a specific race culture influencing a metro. So my example is like, let's say it's a Vec metropolis, and is there a advantage to having a Vec metro specifically because if they have an observatory, that's going to affect the whole world? So that on a server, people might say, yeah, I want to make sure there's always a Vec metro on this server because otherwise I'm not going to get this.
I'm always hesitant to ever use the term advantage. I always refer to these things as I always refer to these as give and takes, right? Like but usually it's give and take. Like let's say for example, the Vec have the influence over Metropolis, right? There is an attrition score. Well, I don't know if I want to get into this too much, but I don't want to give that away. But is there an advantage? Is there some benefit?
I don't mean benefit is more.
Sure. Is there a benefit, so to speak? If you're Vec, yes, there are benefits to having a cultural influence over a node and being a citizen of that node, for sure. I won't detail what those are, but there are benefits there. And yeah, I would just leave it at a simple yes.
But I guess what I'm saying, like, say I'm a Nakua.
Sure.
Is there something that specifically a VEC observatory might
There are racial.
I might want as a Nakua because it's a VEC observatory and that allows me to do something else. I don't
much to the same sense that there are racial skills and influences over your race selection as a character. The same thing can be held true for nodes. So nodes do have racial components. It's not just an aesthetic. It also influences other things that are more mechanical in the game.
Right, but I'm saying, might someone from another race might find it beneficial to have a different race have a metropolis? That's
yes.
Kind of what
yes. It depends on their focuses.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Okay. Phantom, you might try to drop in your question.
I'm watching the clock. It's okay. I know. We got 20 minutes. Actually, just sort of quick. So I'm big into crafting. I'm a crafter, not a fighter. So
I'm a lover, not a fighter. I like that. I'm a crafter, not a fighter.
Yes. So, actually, I am curious, and I don't know if you can answer this. Where you think we're at as far as with the testing phases coming up, as far as actually testing crafting. Is that something that's still a little ways away?
No, crafting honestly will not come online in any sense of its true form until Alpha 2. So Alpha 1 has essentially what are intended to be the core loop of crafting, meaning the collection of materials, the translation of those materials into processed goods, and then the use of those processed goods into item acquisition. Right. That's the core gameplay loop that's currently present in Alpha 1. But those are mostly facilitated, kind of piggybacking the merchant systems right now, and not actually using the real crafting system. And that's just because crafting hasn't been completed in a form that can be implemented in Alpha 1, but it will be for Alpha 2. So what's present in Alpha 1 doesn't even touch the surface or scratch the surface for crafting.
And then the other thing I've been trying to figure out, and seeing the comments on how we level up or become a master crafter, it kind of talks about how it's a time investment, resource investment. I was trying to figure out how we actually will level through the process. Is it an experience point gain? Is it a skill point sort of system?
It's going to be both through experience and accomplishment. So those are really the two means of progression through the artisanship trees. Both of those is through repetition in regards to the actions you can take depending on which branch you're in for the artisanship tree, and then also achievement. Basically, there are going to be benchmarks at which each person of those trees is going to have to work through and achieve that benchmark, and that's going to give them access to the next branch.
Okay. And then recipes, I understand they can come from a lot of different places. Are those going to be tradable, sellable? I know there was the talk about, I guess, leasing them, or that's not the right word, but that I saw.
So basically recipes will function, and this is still open for change because we have some prototypes we want to play with when we do get into this. But as it stands currently, recipes will have a consumption essentially where you commit it to your recipe book. So prior to it being committed to your book, it can be traded, it can be sold. But once you want to use it and craft something from it, you have to commit it to your recipe book. And once it's committed, now it is the consumption is gone. The recipe is gone, and you have it in your book, and that's that.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, is there going to be much room for like player experimentation? Like, can you take a longsword hilt and a dagger blade and make like a dirk instead of trying to find a recipe for one?
That's a cool idea, but it doesn't really function that way. We want it to be more of a acquisition rather than. I mean, we have systems that function like that. Like, for example, the animal husbandry system, right? You can kind of find mix and match different types of combinations. But crafting is a much more particular type of function, of almost a science, so to speak, right? And in that regard, it's not something that we want to mix and match, discovery wise. By the way, I just realized I don't think we've actually given out any of this information from a crafting standpoint. I think we've touched on some of this, but I think I might have given some stuff away. Don't get me in trouble. You're going to get me in trouble.
Well, I mean, I can ship. Well, you brought up animal husbandry.
You didn't say anything.
Did I not? Okay, very good. Thank you, Diggs. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think you say.
Actually,
What's the
mentioned.
saying? You can get in good trouble.
We need distortion on the stream.
I'll cut it out on YouTube. We'll cut out all of this crafting stuff. You do mention animal husbandry. That's something I'm very excited about because you can ask these guys. I've talked a lot about the idea of breeding, crossbreeding within an MMO for quite a long time. The way that the system is sort of set up, what will the husbandry chart? Eventually, will players basically know all there is to know as far as combining? Or will there always be some sort of some element that's unknown to the player, or just random enough that you can't actually pin it down?
I mean, eventually is a long time. And I think that eventually, yes. I mean, just from my experience in other games that have had more RNG or discovery related type systems, eventually there is going to be an understanding for those things. And I think that eventually will.
Yeah. Because I guess it depends on how far you take it. I always looked at it from a genetic standpoint, and whether you're looking at a trait from one gene, two genes, can a gene have different type, just how complex it gets.
Well, the idea is similar in that structure, right? Like if you were to consider the traits that particular animals have and consider those genetic, so to speak, right? When you're combining those animals, you will surface undiscovered genes that will essentially influence what your creation is, so to speak. So the idea is to have both an element of RNG associated with those pairings, much like genetics have, whether they surface as dominant or not, and that yield then will give you the new product, so to speak.
Then I have go ahead.
As I said, every time you bring this up, I was the Charles Darwin of Wizard 101 pet breeding, and there is still the website that's being maintained called the Pet Gnome Project, where I went through and just methodically bred different pets together and then found a way of, these are the traits that the original pet has. This is what you want to do to try and make sure that your descendants have that same, or rather the traits that you want.
Right.
If you have a person who's dedicated to doing that, somebody's going to come up with the methodology, I think.
For sure. Absolutely. They always will. And it's funny because as you were describing that, I was thinking there's like a little phone app that I used to have a long time ago. I think it was called like Alchemy or Total Alchemy or something, where you kind of like had elements on the side and you just start with those elements and you can
Alchemy.
Pull them in. Yeah, exactly. And you could pull them in and it would create something new, and you could pull in that and make something new. And then there's like, eventually you had this like huge compendium of, things that you had created from just those four elements. Now, this is similar to that, but with animals. And in a sense, each time you add something together, it doesn't always result in the same thing. So that's just add a little caveat.
So the last, I could take up forever, but the last sort of focus I want to mention is just farms, because specific to crafting, I have always talked about being sort of a farmer within the game, and this whole backstory of a paladin that no longer wants to fight. But anyways, there's not a lot of information on farming. With the one thing that is not clear, I know with, when we talk about artisan classes, gatherer, processor, crafter, I see farming could kind of be all three of those. So if you have a farm, like what are you actually able to do or not do? You would gather the seeds, I guess, so that you can plant, and then you would process the corn after it's done, and potentially you'd be cooking on site too. So, I know there's farm hands. Do they take up part of that role?
Farming predominantly lives within the gathering tree of the artisanship system. So essentially, the way kind of farming complements what would be in the wild gathering, right? Is these are more specific applications of kind of returns, and these are timed returns that you can have leveraging essentially the freehold system and the areas of that. Now, once you've collected that farmed material, that's when you process it into a craftable material, or you can take it directly through some of the farming professions into a consumable item, whether that be through cooking or through alchemy or any types of those things. So the idea there is it does live predominantly in the gathering branch.
Okay. And then the sort of last thing with that, tying it into animal husbandry, is there any thought as far as breeding with farm animals, that sort of animal husbandry system, or even within crops themselves, corn and all that sort of stuff?
Breeding animals with corn? I'm sorry, say it one time.
Sorry, I mixed up two thoughts. I mean, we could try that. I would be more than happy to.
I was like, wait, now I'm looking at a cow that's textured with corn skin, and I'm just like, hey, what would that yield? I'm like, I don't know.
I've seen a turtle with some fauna on it.
I mean,
so I don't know.
It's growing like plants out of the back. It's like a walking garden. Yeah, that'd be great.
If you give me the ability to try, I will. No, it's just more taking.
I'm concerned now. We're gonna have to watch your account. But no, sorry. Go ahead.
More so taking the breeding ideas with animal husbandry. Will those apply to farm animals? But then also when you talk about crops,
I see what you're saying.
If there's two different types of corn,
GMO corn and stuff. Okay, got it. No, not specifically. Animal husbandry, that would be a nightmare of a system I would have to consider, because just of the sheer intention for a number of crops that are going to be available through the farming system, that would be concerning. But no, I would say no, it won't. That's going to be delegated specifically to the animal husbandry system.
I have a related crafting question from the forums from Mao. That says, so this is like the artisan system, and he's wondering how involved you envision the gathering, processing, crafting processes to be. And he says these activities typically take a few seconds to load ingredients into a machine. You go do something else, then returning when products are ready. Much less involved compared to what typical gatherers do. So I guess it's a time factor in the crafting process is what he's wondering.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the different ideas that we have for some of those time-related activities. But I would say that there is I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of reverb from somebody. Is somebody else getting that? Can you hear me? I can hear it. Okay. Yeah. All right. Oh, they went away. Thank you. So what was I saying?
You don't want to get too much.
I don't want to get into too much detail, but I would say there's a comfortable blend between making a repeatable system in the game interactive, and then that interaction losing its novelty after the 10th, 20th, 30th, or 50th time, and now it just becomes encumbersome. So, we want to make this wheel kind of traditional in that regard, what people are used to from crafting. And crafting's kind of a finicky subject because, as you guys know, as crafters out there, right? Those of you who are crafters, there's something to be said for that process where you're just kind of, playing with one hand, so to speak, sitting back, enjoying the time, running through your materials, running bulk processes on the processing side. Like there is something to be said for time-related completion systems, right? And we don't want to make it a mini game. We don't want to make it like, some labor-intensive involved mechanic and system, because that just becomes really boring really fast, and it actually deters you from wanting to participate in that system. If this were a more session-based game, and it wasn't a persistent mmorpg with traditional crafting methods, I'd be like, okay, yeah, it might be something cool, or for like a browser or mobile game or something, maybe get the user in more intended. But we're an mmorpg. We have some traditional wheels, and crafting is one of those traditional wheels.
You just bring a whole lot of Star Wars Galaxy's thoughts up about how, yes, it might be the same recipe, but the materials that you're gathering are completely procedural, and how that's such a big impact on things. Obviously, that's not what's going on, or I don't think that's what's going on here. But I did like that it had certain levels of deliberation to picking the right material components that go into each of the different parts of the thing that you're crafting. And it's not that you couldn't do that with this. It could be that, somebody's making a weapon and a very high quality copper core to a certain sort of iron sword might actually make it stronger and more resilient, or
exactly.
a lightning element, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that Jeff in particular has a soft spot in his heart for the crafting system of Star Wars Galaxies. So without getting into too much detail, I will say that it's likely you will see some inspiration, surface itself in that regard.
Well, we
I
had
have a kind of related question to crafting about advanced weapons. When I was at PAX West in 2017, Jeffrey said that advanced weapons could have up to 5 weapon abilities, and I'm wondering if that's still part of the game design, and also if that QTE is still associated with the combat that we saw there.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So the weapon abilities are essentially dependent on the class of weapon and the grade of weapon. So as players spec into these different class of weapons, right, whether they be blunt or slashing or piercing, right, those types of things, you're going to have related options to spec into with your skill points what can proc off of these weapon attacks. The QuickTime event is no longer associated with that. There's a few new combat prototypes that are going to be vetted in the next few rounds of Alpha 1, and I will stress that these new combat revamps are just the early stages of different directions for combat. So you're not, people who are watching, you should not expect to see a new completed final form of combat for Alpha 1. These are the different directions we're taking. We're internally vetting some of these prototypes, and we'll be incorporating them for the March playtest. But yes, the combat skills, the weapon skills, are still a plan for the combat system. I think they're an important parity between your active skill selection, right? Because the intention is to synergize with those active skills. And it's obvious it is an RNG element of combat to speak, right? Whereas traditionally combat is more skill oriented, but whenever you have just plain old skill associated with this combat, it can become, again, a little monotonous. And you do want to incorporate some opportunity for RNG. And a way you do that is through these types of procced effects and how they might be impactful and amplify your skill-related condition modifiers if they synergize with the condition effect from the weapon proc.
So are these something that enchanters put on the weapons, or are
these are things that you so for example, I don't know if you've seen some of the UI images out of Alpha 1, but you have a skill window, and the skill window has passives on one side, active skills on the other side, and then weapon skills. So these are trees you're speccing into. And when you have that weapon group equipped, that's going to be your saved tree for that weapon group, and that's going to have the opportunity there.
Something we've been talking about a little bit lately too is I've never personally had a good experience with combat underwater. I know Diggs disagrees to some degree, but when we start talking about naval combat and underwater combat, I'm just curious, like, what experience you've had. Like, what has there been something that you've actually enjoyed that sort of drives your thought process?
It's difficult with underwater content because what I've found is that traditionally underwater combat, or at least underwater content, there's always an added element of control schema that is kind of obtuse and restrictive, and just kind of finding the parity between what a player is accustomed to on land and then what you must make them become accustomed to for underwater, that both make sense from a design element of like, hey, you're underwater, you shouldn't walk the same, like you have to swim, and here's what swimming feels like, and swimming feels like crap, I don't want to swim. It's like that's traditionally what I've discovered in MMOs, or at least games that have attempted underwater combat. I think that that we're going to have to be a little bit creative in the way we present this underwater content. I think there's two sections. There's combat and there's content. And content doesn't always have to be combat, obviously. In that regard, some of the content I've experienced in the past with underwater games, and particularly like Arcade, I enjoyed the treasure finding. I enjoyed being on a submersible. I enjoyed water mounts. I enjoy all of those were underwater. I thought those were a lot of fun. I didn't much like the underwater raiding. I didn't much like the in water raid fights. I liked the on ship stuff. The on ship was great and fun, and it was kind of like a detriment if you fell into the water. Like you didn't want to fall into the water, you didn't want to get into the water unless you were a part of like some particular team that had to do like water related mechanics. If you're like an archer team under the ghost ship or something, like but traditionally people weren't like, oh yeah, I want to be on that team. They were like, no, I want to be on the boat. but I think there's going to be some testing that's going to be needed to be had on the combat related side. But from a content related side, I think there's a lot of discovery related activities that are going to be in the ocean, and there's going to be a lot of complementary mechanics that you can use from an item acquisition standpoint to help with that content. And that's going to be kind of the chase for players who want to be out at sea. They're going to have to acquire those things, and they're going to have to they're going to want to participate in that content, whether it be treasure finding, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think water and then ice and EverQuest have been the two most environmental experiences I hated the most.
Right.
So, well, we're getting close to. We got about 5 more minutes. So, and probably tons more questions, but I'll leave it to you two. I took quite a bit of time on crafting. So.
I have an RP question from, I think, 2017. So frequently in 2017, when people asked you about roleplay support in Ashes of Creation, you would say, yeah, we have plenty of support for that in taverns. I don't understand why roleplay would be a tavern-specific thing. So I'm wondering what your concept of roleplay is, and why that would be happening in taverns rather than everywhere else in the game.
It might have just been used as an example, like for example in taverns. I don't know if I would want to have said like it's just delegated to taverns. No. I mean, role play is obviously a very important flavor that many players enjoy, right? I mean, we are a mmorpg anyways, right? So in that regard, when you think of like things you can include to enhance the role play experience, you think about potentially chat bubbles. You think about emotes. You think about the ability to, dance with other players, to have items that are just specific to role play, like presenting flowers to somebody and just acquiring that item to do that thing. These are elements that not just mix progression for role play as well. Like you don't just want all your role play tools coming out of the box when you create your character. You want something to strive for in the game as well. There can be even events and ceremonies that can be initiated. For example, a wedding, right? You might have an NPC that is just specifically an RP event NPC, where this is a person who marries you and you come up to them and they have a quest that relates to finding the cosmetic, attire for the wedding. And once you have that achieved, you must find a best man or a maid of honor, and having people sign up for these are systems that can be created around immersion in the game that I've always wanted to aspire. Now those things might not all come online by the time we launch, because we do have obviously a backlog of designs and ideas that I would love to incorporate, and I do hate to say it, but when juggling the act of like games and systems and mechanics and RP mechanics, like sometimes the RP stuff can take a back seat to the game mechanic stuff, right? But there will be a sprinkling of that at launch, and there's intents to incorporate more of that as expansions come and updates come thereafter. But it's not lost on me like the importance that players who play RPGs play it for the RP experience and the ability to interact with another human being on a different level than what we're accustomed to in real life, right? That's why we play these fantasy games or these sci-fi games, is to have an experience that you can't get in real life.
Yeah, and I think especially when you talk about that, the thing that I find missing, this is from World of Warcraft, is when you're on a ship traveling somewhere else and other people come on, I kind of want to do something with them other than just dance. And I
Right,
don't know
like
if that would
"Arr, matey," and like slap him on the face or something. Like pull out a
I don't
glass
know,
of rum and like throw it on the deck, or tar the thing. So it's like these activities that might not have mechanical importance, but it sets the stage for what it should be like to be on a pirate ship. You know what I mean? Like that's
Yep. Go, Nero.
Actually, the question that I was going to have you kind of answer in there was exactly how responsive to role play are the NPCs going to be? And you said maybe there's some that are specifically like role play related, but I think of, just the idea of asking any character, especially if they are working on something or they appear to be in distress, to actually be able to interact and engage with them and say like, "Hey buddy, how's it going?"
Like, what's wrong with your day? Tell me your story. And then like through that interaction, you come with like a hidden quest line that's like, I just separated from my girlfriend 2 weeks ago and she took my cat. And you're like, oh, let me go chat with your girlfriend about this, like incorporating elements that are a little bit more flavorful than what you would come to anticipate. Absolutely.
Nice. That'll be really nice. It all very much seems like, trying to hit all the big points on what do MMOs lack, what do we like about tabletop games, and how can we kind of go from point A to point B to reconcile those differences. So definitely exciting to see all of this come together here.
For sure. It's a process, right? Like, I often say, Intrepid and Ashes of Creation is a passion project of mine, right? And anytime you're doing something that you're passionate about, you want to make sure it's perfect. But sometimes you can get stuck in that mindset of like, oh, it has to be perfect or else we can, it's either perfect or not at all. But I think the important thing to note is that like when we're creating this game, we are doing it with making something, and I've often said this in the past, that's going to make us proud and the players proud, and making it of the right quality and of the right expectations. And everybody on Ashes on the team at Intrepid is passionate about this project. I mean, I am the last step interview for every person we hire and have hired in this company thus far. And almost during that process, and I've said this in the past, I'm also I'm trying to dissuade the person from actually joining the team because I want them to fight for it. You know what I mean? I want them to show that they're as passionate about getting something like this project done, and this is up their alley as not just a developer, but as a player as well, because that's where we can get our best work from people. And I can safely say that everyone on this team, not just from a talent standpoint, from a work ethic standpoint, from a dedication and commitment standpoint, like, yes, those are there, but also they're passionate. And passion sometimes as a word is like, sometimes you hate to use it because it can have such an amorphous, subjective meaning, and like, what does passion represent? But really, passion to me represents that you are giving it your all because your all is what you want to see from this game. And a lot of people on the team are like that. And we just started this last hiring round, and we've had a lot of great applicants. We've already hired, I think, like 6 or 7 in January, and our target is 30 something over the next couple of months. So anybody who's watching or watches the YouTube video afterwards, the more you guys can help get the word out for Ashes and just like tag devs that you like, tag devs that have done great things in the past, that's all super beneficial for us, and it goes to create a better game. So take that into account.
We will happily do that. We started really was EverQuest Next was sort of how we started back in 2014. So seeing so many kind of former Sony people, with you has made us actually quite happy. We have a lot of EverQuest guys and gals. I will say, gosh, I don't know. I mean, we have at least over 30 or over 30, at least over 30 people who came from Sony, Daybreak days. A lot of them who touched EverQuest in some way, shape, or form. And, it's great to have that type of experience and veteranship on the team because, they get to incorporate that knowledge, obviously, in the project as we move forward. And that's a voice that's present in every discussion, right? And those are things that are near and dear to our hearts as players. These are franchises that have essentially paved the way, for all future developments, so to speak. So it's great to have those influences. 100%, I agree. Well, we are unfortunately, I think, at the end of our time.
It felt like it was just I felt like we were just getting started, but I always feel like that. I talk too much. I'm so
I mean,
sorry.
I can go another
don't
hour.
apologize.
So.
Everything you've had to say has been amazing. And quite honestly, if you're feeling bad about it, we are more than happy to have you come on after the next test between other ones.
It definitely has to be sooner than what was it? 3 years?
Yes.
Yes, please.
So I have one more question.
You've been a little
that has to
busy.
be answered.
I know. I'll take one more question. You got it, Diggs. Anything for you, buddy.
Okay. When will we get Nodes Part 3? But the real question is kind of related. So I'm really wondering when we can expect the third article for node types, because we've been waiting for more node articles.
That's my fault.
The better question is articles in general, because it seems to me that with the open development that you were hoping for in the beginning, you had to modify that somewhat. But it seems like articles would be okay, and it's okay if you change those over time.
Well, you got to be careful. You say it's okay to change those over time, but not every player says that. So let's just be clear.
Asking, that's what I want to hear.
I will say that on the article front, especially with regards to nodes, right? I have put a hold on the pending 2 articles that are available, which stem obviously from our GDD, from the designs we have in place. But those are in flux from an idea perspective, and I'm not going to commit articles to the public unless I have a greater certainty that those are the intended designs and plans. Now, that's not to say that when the articles come out, they can't change. They still can. It's just the degree to which these pending articles are in flux is high enough for me to say to Margaret, no, you can't put those articles out yet. So that's on the nodes front. On the nodes 3, I've said in the past, the nodes series are an important series from a new player perspective. Old players, people who've been following the game for a while, they love them. But when those types of things happen, they garnish a lot of new, fresh eyes. And I want to make sure that when the later episodes of Nodes 3 and 4 come out, they're closer to a time period that is a better reflection of the state of the game as it relates to what it will look like in the end, and not where it's currently at in the more iterative work in progress stages. So you can see, if you just look back a year and a half, just over the past 18 months, where the project has moved both visually, mechanically, and gameplay-wise, it is a significant disparity. And if you imagine the next, 6, 12, 18 months, potentially, as we get closer to launch and completion of the game, it's going to advance even further at either the same multitude or higher. So I want to make sure that those are marketing events, essentially, just to be clear. They are marketing events. They're an update to the community. They're a transparent development process, yes, but because by nature they attract eyes, they are essentially a marketing event.
Yeah, but articles in general, how are you? Do you have more in the pipeline?
We have definitely, absolutely, and those, I think right now, really, we're waiting for the end of February launch of the new site, and then it's likely you will start to see those trickle out again. The community, Margaret and the marketing team, they do a great job, I think, of helping to brandish these events and these updates. And I think the article stuff will start picking up again with the launch of the new site.
All right. Well, with that, Steven, we thank you very much. It's been a pleasure seeing you again. And as Nero said, hopefully here in the next maybe few months rather than few years, we'll get to see you again.
Absolutely. I have enjoyed it. I always love chatting with you guys. You are gamers at the heart, and it's always fun to chat with fellow gamers, especially about something we're all passionate about. So thank you guys for having me. And to the audience, I love you guys tuning in. Thank you for tuning in. Watch these guys. They're great. They have great discussions and theory crafting. I love it.
And everyone watching, thank you for joining. And that being said, we are live every Sunday at the same time, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. So join us. See ya. Have a good week.
Bye, everybody.